In his cluttered garage, surrounded by humming machines and half-finished inventions, Rick stared at a screen that refused to behave. Numbers flickered. Graphs twisted. Probability curves failed to settle. "That's not possible," Rick muttered, taking a long drink from his flask. Across the multiverse, a chaos was normal, but even chaos followed rules. Randomness still obeyed mathematics. Every universe, no matter how absurd, eventually stabilized into something measurable. This one didn't. Rick ran the scan again. And again. The readings showed a universe where outcomes didn't converge, where cause and effect bent just enough to avoid collapsing, yet never made sense. A universe where probability itself seemed hesitant, uncertain. Rick's eyes narrowed. Curiosity, the dangerous kind, crept in. He traced the anomaly signature, watching layers of reality peel back on the screen. Dimensions blurred past. War-torn timelines, dead civilizations, joke universes that had gone too far. Then it stopped. The signal anchored itself in a place Rick hadn't expected. A colorful, absurd world labeled simply as "Ooh." Rick scoffed. "A candy-colored fantasy land," he said. "Yeah, sure." But the data didn't lie. Inside "Ooh," one variable kept repeating. Not a location, not an artifact. A person. Rick isolated the anomaly, zooming in until the chaos sharpened into motion. A boy. Barefoot, may blonde. Laughing as he charged into danger, with the sword far too big for him. Finn. Rick watched silently as Finn leapt into a fight he statistically should have lost. The odds were terrible. The outcome was obvious. And yet, Finn won. Rick's predictive model recalculated. Failure rate, recalculated. Outcome, wrong. Rick frowned. He adjusted the parameters, added fear, pain, survival instinct. Finn still won. The day Rick detected an impossible variable. Rick rewound the footage. Again. Finn's movements weren't precise. He wasn't calculating angles or predicting attacks. There was no advanced technique, no hidden genius. Just forward motion. Just belief. That made no sense. Rick overlaid probability graphs onto the scene. Each strike, each jump, each reckless decision should have resulted in injury or worse. The numbers screamed failure. Yet the universe bent around the boy. Rick's fingers danced across the console, pulling deeper data from Ooh's timeline. Battles Finn had survived. Choices he'd made. Moments where death should have been certain. Every event shared the same signature. Probability didn't collapse. It detoured. Rick paused the screen on a single frame. Finn midair, sword raised, eyes wide but unafraid. "Luck doesn't repeat," Rick said. "Miracles don't stack." He initiated a localized prediction test. Instead of analyzing Ooh as a whole, he isolated Finn, alone removed allies, stripped environmental advantages, erased narrative momentum. The model failed instantly. A red warning flashed. Error, outcome undefined. Rick blinked. He hadn't seen that message in centuries. He leaned back, irritated, then leaned forward again, curiosity tightening his jaw. Rick expanded the scan, mapping the universe around Finn. Magic fields, emotional resonance, narrative density. Nothing explained it. Ooh wasn't bending probability. Finn was. Rick watched as Finn laughed after the fight, brushing dirt from his clothes like nothing unusual had happened. No trauma, no hesitation, no reflection on how close he'd come to dying. To Rick, that was the most disturbing part. Most beings learned fear. Fear created patterns. Patterns could be predicted. Finn didn't accumulate fear. He accumulated resolve. Rick's sensors spiked again. The anomaly strengthened not from the battle, but from Finn's choice to keep going. To seek the next danger without pause. Rick muttered to himself, pacing the garage. If this kid exists, he said, then free will isn't just messy. It's unstable. The implications rippled outward. A single variable that couldn't be solved could infect larger systems. Entire universes could drift. Outcomes could unravel. Rick looked back at the screen, eyes hardening. A decision formed, slow, reluctant, but unavoidable. He didn't need to destroy Uru. He needed to understand it. More accurately, he needed to understand Finn. Rick opened a portal, green light spilling across the floor. He hesitated for just a moment, staring at the frozen image of the boy who refused to obey math. For the record, Rick said quietly, this is a terrible idea. Then he stepped forward. The portal didn't open above a battlefield or a throne room. It opened in the middle of a quiet hill. Rick stepped out into warm air and unreal colors. The grass was too green. The sky held a soft gradient that felt painted rather than natural. Everything looked harmless, exaggerated, almost childish. Rick hated it immediately. His boots sank slightly into the ground as he scanned the environment. The readings were inconsistent. Physics existed, but only when they felt like it. Gravity wavered. Matter behaved politely, as if aware it was being watched. This place is a lie, Rick muttered. A short distance away, Finn sat on a rock, tightening the strap of his backpack. His sword rested beside him, nicked and worn from countless fights. There was no celebration in his posture, no sense of victory, just preparation. Rick stayed invisible, observing. Finn stood, stretched, and looked toward the horizon with a quiet determination. Whatever he'd just survived was already behind him. Whatever came next, he was ready. Rick's scanner pulsed. Probability distortion detected. Not spiking. Stabilizing around Finn. Rick frowned. The universe wasn't correcting Finn's actions, it was adapting to them. As if reality itself had accepted the boy's presence and adjusted its expectations accordingly. Rick zoomed in on Finn's neural patterns. No enhanced cognition, no supernatural intellect, just emotional clarity, purpose without doubt. That shouldn't have worked. Rick watched as a small creature burst from the bushes, aggressive, loud, poorly planned. Finn reacted instantly, not with a calculation, but instinct. He spoke softly, offered peace, then defended himself when it failed. The fight lasted seconds. Finn won again. Rick sighed, rubbing his face. You don't optimize, Rick whispered. You don't calculate. You don't even hesitate. He deactivated his cloak, stepping into the open. Finn turned immediately, sword in hand, but his stance wasn't hostile. It was cautious, curious. Whoa, Finn said. Hey? Rick raised an eyebrow. No fear spike, no panic, just alert interest. Name's Rick, he said. I'm from somewhere that makes this place look like a napkin doodle. Finn smiled. Cool, he said. I'm Finn. Rick stared at him, genuinely unsettled. There it was again. No awe, no intimidation, no collapse into narrative importance. Just a boy meeting a stranger. Rick's scanner screamed warning. It wasn't just an anomaly. This was a variable that refused to acknowledge its own significance. And that made it dangerous. Rick circled Finn slowly, his scanner humming as it pulled in layers of data that refused to align. Every reading contradicted the last. No hidden energy source, no cosmic enhancement, no narrative anchor strong enough to justify what Rick had observed. Finn shifted his weight, watching Rick with relaxed attention. So, Finn said, are you like a wizard or a scientist? Rick snorted. Those are the same thing where I'm from? Finn nodded as if that made perfect sense. Rick stopped in front of him. You ever think about why you survive? He asked. Why things work out for you when they really shouldn't? Finn considered the question. Not long, not deeply. I guess, he said slowly, I just try to do the right thing, and then I keep going. Rick's jaw tightened. There it was again, no strategy, no self-preservation instinct driving the answer. Just forward motion purpose without analysis. Rick projected a hologram between them. Branching timelines, millions of Finns making millions of choices. Every branch fractured differently, yet none collapsed completely. You don't see this, Rick said. But the universe does. Every time you choose someone else over yourself, reality bends just a little. Finn stared at the shifting lights, unimpressed. Huh, he said. That's kind of heavy. Rick waited for fear, for doubt, for existential panic. It never came. Finn picked up his sword, resting it over his shoulder. So, is that bad? Rick didn't answer immediately. For the first time, he felt something uncomfortably close to respect. You're not breaking the universe, Rick said finally. You're reminding it that equations aren't laws. Finn smiled, small, genuine, unburdened. That's good, right? Rick turned away, opening a portal behind him. Green light spilled across the grass, warping the colors of ooh. It's dangerous, Rick said. To systems. To control. To people like me. Finn tilted his head. Then why tell me? Rick paused at the edge of the portal. Because, he said quietly, if someone like you exists, then not everything has to make sense to matter. He stepped through. The portal snapped shut, leaving Finn alone on the hill. He stood there for a moment, feeling no different than before, except for a faint awareness that somewhere beyond ooh, someone had noticed him. Back in the garage, Rick stared at the data one last time. The anomaly remained. Unresolved. Unsolvable. Rick shut off the screen. For the first time in years, he let a mystery exist. From a fractured pocket of space layered just beyond the visible spectrum, he watched. Finn moved through his world like nothing had changed. No paranoia, no hesitation. No sudden awareness that reality itself had been examining him. If anything, the boy seemed lighter, humming to himself as he walked, sword tapping against his leg. Rick activated long-range observation drones, each tuned to a different predictive model. One measured survival probability. Another tracked emotional decision-making. A third simulated fear response under escalating threat. The results conflicted immediately. Finn charged into danger without scanning his surroundings. He ignored high ground. He abandoned tactical advantage to help weaker allies. He laughed in situations where stress should have impaired judgment. Every model flagged the same conclusion. Failure imminent. Yet the universe refused to comply. An ambush unfolded exactly as Rick predicted. Enemies appeared. Terrain collapsed. Escape routes vanished. The math was flawless. Finn still won. Rick tightened his grip on the console. He adjusted the parameters, introduced artificial variables, altered wind resistance, delayed reaction time, environmental instability, small changes, controlled ones. The kind that always tipped outcomes in Rick's favor. Finn adapted without noticing. He slipped where he should have fallen. He missed strikes that somehow became feints. He took hits that redirected the fight instead of ending it. Rick watched probability curves bend, not sharply, not dramatically, but just enough to avoid collapse, like a river flowing around an immovable stone. That's not optimization, Rick muttered. That's refusal. He paused the simulation and isolated Finn's emotional state. Fear levels remained low even under lethal threat. Not suppressed, simply absent. Finn acknowledged danger, then moved past it. Rick injected a new variable: loss. He simulated scenarios where Finn failed to save someone, where his choices led to irreversible damage, where guilt should accumulate and slow him down. Finn didn't retreat. He grieved. Then he continued. Rick felt a flicker of unease. Fear created hesitation. Hesitation created patterns. Patterns could be predicted. Finn skipped that step entirely. His courage didn't come from confidence or denial. It came from acceptance. Rick leaned back, staring at the data streams unraveling before him. If you don't fear the outcome, Rick said quietly, then the equation doesn't apply. For the first time, Rick wasn't watching a hero. He was watching a flaw in the system. And flaws didn't belong in stable universes. Rick escalated the tests. Observation wasn't enough anymore. He introduced subtle disruptions, the kind no one noticed, but probability always did. A fraction of a second delay in Finn's footing. A microscopic imbalance in his sword's weight. A shift in atmospheric density during combat. Each change should have mattered. None of them did. Finn's movements adjusted naturally without conscious correction. Not faster, not smarter, just aligned, as if the world itself was compensating for him. Rick isolated the cause. It wasn't skill. Finn wasn't the most precise fighter Rick had seen. It wasn't strength, either. Plenty of beings across the multiverse hit harder. And it wasn't luck. Luck fluctuated. Finn didn't. The constant was intent. Finn committed fully to every choice he made. No retreat baked into his decisions. No contingency plan if things went wrong. Once he chose a direction, the universe seemed to follow. Rick initiated a high-risk simulation. He removed external rewards. No praise, no visible success. He placed Finn in scenarios where victory provided nothing, no satisfaction, no recognition, no immediate benefit. Finn still acted. Rick watched as Finn defended strangers who would never know his name. He stepped into danger that offered no narrative payoff, no lesson, no glory. That was the part Rick couldn't model. Most heroes acted because they expected something: survival, validation, purpose. Even selflessness had patterns. Finn's didn't. Rick's AI flagged a critical inconsistency. Subject displays courage without incentive. Rick stared at the warning. Incentive drives behavior, Rick said. Behavior drives outcomes. He removed incentive entirely. Finn kept going. Rick leaned forward, fingers steepled. What are you running on? He whispered. He examined Finn's neurological data again. No abnormal dopamine spikes, no reward loop amplification, just a steady emotional baseline anchored by something simple. Choice. Finn wasn't reacting to danger. He was choosing action. That distinction shattered Rick's predictive framework. Reaction could be measured. Choice, unburdened by fear or expectation, couldn't. Rick felt a rare tightening in his chest. Not fear, but something adjacent to it. Concern. If Finn existed, then courage wasn't a variable. It was a constant. And constants broke systems that depended on control. Rick's console flashed again. Rick stopped altering the environment. He altered Finn. From his hidden vantage point, Rick released a controlled psychological probe, not a weapon, not a threat. A question embedded directly into Finn's perception. A whisper of doubt engineered to surface when decision-making peaked. Finn paused. For a fraction of a second, uncertainty crossed his face. Rick's models surged to life. Finally, the probe fed Finn a vision, a future where his choices failed, where people he cared about suffered because he wasn't strong enough, where courage led not to victory but regret. Rick watched closely. Fear response elevated. Stress markers rising. Prediction confidence climbing. Finn's grip tightened on his sword. Then he breathed. The doubt didn't vanish. Finn acknowledged it. Let it exist, then moved anyway. Rick's models collapsed again. Finn didn't reject fear. He carried it, and still chose action. Rick froze the feed, replaying the moment frame by frame. Finn's heart rate stabilized faster than any subject Rick had ever observed. Not through denial, through acceptance. Rick muttered under his breath, "You're not fearless. You're immune." He escalated again. This time, Rick introduced consequence. Permanent consequence. He simulated a scenario where Finn's choice directly caused irreversible loss. No reset, no lesson, just damage. Finn faltered. He mourned. And then he stood up. Rick felt his jaw tighten. Most beings broke at that point. Trauma rewired them. Fear reshaped their future decisions. Patterns emerged. Finn's didn't. The loss didn't make him reckless. It made him deliberate. Finn's courage evolved, but it didn't weaken. Rick shut down the probe. Silence filled the observation pocket. For the first time since discovering the anomaly, Rick felt something close to unease. Not because Finn was powerful, but because he wasn't. Power followed rules. Finn followed choice. Rick reduced the data. Not because it overwhelmed him, but because it didn't help anymore. Every model failed the same way. Not gradually, not partially. They didn't even come close. Finn existed outside the predictive space Rick relied on to understand the universe. Rick tried one last approach. He stopped testing outcomes and focused on origins. He traced Finn's timeline back to its earliest recorded moments. Childhood choices, early losses, first battles. The point where fear should have shaped him into something cautious. That moment never came. Finn had been consistent from the start. Not reckless, not naive. Resolved. Rick compared Finn to other heroes across the multiverse: warriors, saviors, chosen ones. All of them showed deviation under stress. Fear altered their decisions. Power corrupted them. Responsibility slowed them down. Finn resisted all three. Not because he was special. Because he didn't see himself as special at all. That realization unsettled Rick more than any failed equation. If Finn didn't believe he was important, then his actions weren't tied to identity or ego. They weren't driven by destiny. They were driven by presence. Rick exhaled slowly. A hero without narrative gravity, he said. That's dangerous. He watched Finn laugh with a friend moments after surviving another lethal encounter. No processing, no myth building, just living. Rick's systems updated their final assessment. Threat level, non-aggressive, a system impact, unstable. Rick accepted it. Finn wasn't a threat because he wanted to change the universe. He was a threat because the universe couldn't change him. Rick shut down his observation array. The screens faded, leaving only one image: Finn walking forward, sword resting easily on his shoulder, eyes on the horizon. Rick stood alone in the quiet pocket of space. There are universes built on rules, Rick said softly. And then there are people who remind those rules they're optional. He opened a small portal, not to leave Ooh, but to step closer. Not as a scientist, not as a god, as a witness. Rick hesitated. For the first time, he considered something unfamiliar. Not how to control the anomaly, but whether it should be controlled at all. The portal stabilized. Rick stepped forward. He appeared in front of Finn without warning. The green flash of a portal cutting through the calm of ooh like a surgical incision. The air distorted. The colors bent. Finn stopped mid-step. "Oh," he said. "Hey, you again?" No alarm, no fear, just recognition. Rick studied him in silence. Up close, Finn looked exactly as the data suggested: ordinary. Scuffed boots, worn gloves. A body marked by healed wounds that should have taught him caution. Rick raised the device and pressed a single button. A soft hum filled the air. Finn blinked. What was that?" "Don't worry," Rick said. "I'm just looking." The scan unfolded instantly. Neural pathways, emotional memory clusters, stress responses mapped in real time. Rick sifted through Finn's mind the way he dissected collapsing universes. Loss surfaced first. Faces of people Finn couldn't save. Moments where he'd arrived too late. Regret, raw and unresolved. Rick expected resistance. There was none. Finn's memories weren't locked away or suppressed. They were present. Pain existed, but it didn't dominate. It coexisted with purpose. Rick frowned. He dug deeper. Fear registers appeared, but they didn't spike. They stabilized quickly, folding into resolve instead of panic. The usual sequence was reversed. "Your brain shouldn't do this," Rick muttered. Finn scratched the back of his head. "You sure?" Rick projected the data into the air between them, branching simulations, endless fins facing endless breaking points. "And 99.9% of these," Rick said. "You quit. You freeze. You choose yourself." Finn leaned in, curious. "Huh." Rick activated the simulations. They played out at impossible speed. Finn alone against overwhelming odds. Finn forced to choose between two lives. Finn offered safety in exchange for inaction. Every version hesitated, then moved forward. Not blindly. Deliberately. Rick's jaw tightened as simulation after simulation resolved the same way. "You don't optimize survival," Rick said sharply. "You sacrifice it." Finn tilted his head. "I guess I just don't like leaving people behind." Rick shut off the display with a snap. "Now that's not bravery," he said. "That's malfunction." Finn smiled, calm and genuine. "Feels normal to me." Rick stared at him, irritation bleeding into something deeper. This wasn't defiance. Finn genuinely didn't understand why this mattered. And that made Rick's science feel small. He bypassed surface cognition and dropped straight into memory architecture, not just what Finn remembered, but how those memories shaped him. Emotional weights, decision anchors, the silent rules that guided action. Images flooded the air. Finn as a child, small and alone, choosing to help someone bigger than him. Finn wounded, refusing rest. Finn terrified, stepping forward anyway. Rick isolated the breaking points. He replayed them, again and again. Each time he altered a single variable, increased pain, delayed rescue, heightened personal cost. Each change should have rewritten Finn's response. None of them did. The simulations diverged in method, but not in outcome. Every Finn reached the same conclusion. Others first. Rick's frustration sharpened. "You don't learn," Rick said. "You don't adapt in the way a survival system should." Finn frowned slightly. "I do learn," he said. "I just don't stop caring." Rick froze. That wasn't data, that was a value. Rick adjusted the model this time, targeting Finn's sense of identity. He introduced scenarios where Finn's actions erased his role as a hero, where no one remembered him, where sacrifice led to nothing, no gratitude, no meaning. Finn still chose action. Not because he expected reward, because someone needed help. Rick slammed his palm against the console. Do you have any idea what you're doing? He snapped. Universes collapse when variables refuse to self-correct. Finn looked at him. Not defensive, not angry. Just confused. I'm not trying to break anything, Finn said quietly. I'm just trying to be there. Rick laughed once, sharp and humorless. That's the problem, he said. You don't see the scale. Rick expanded the projection, showing cosmic structures bending, equations destabilizing, systems losing predictive coherence. This, Rick said, pointing, is what happens when people like you exist. Finn studied the image, his expression softened. Looks scary, he said. But those people in there, they still matter, right? Rick hesitated. For a split second, the certainty that fueled his intellect faltered. Yes, Rick said finally. They do. Then Finn replied, I don't see the issue. Silence settled between them. Rick realized something then, something deeply inconvenient. Finn wasn't opposing him. Finn wasn't trying to prove anything. He simply refused to let abstraction outweigh presence. And no equation Rick possessed could argue with that dot. If Finn couldn't be convinced, then he would be demonstrated. With a quick motion, Rick projected a final scenario, not a simulation, but a live construct. A controlled reality bubble unfolded around them, sealing off the outside world. Colors dulled. Sound softened. The air grew heavy. Finn glanced around. This, isn't ooh. No, Rick said. It's cleaner. Inside the construct, figures appeared, fractured echoes of people Finn recognized. Friends, strangers. Versions of lives that depended on him. Rick's voice cut through the silence. One choice, he said. One outcome. The scenario was cruelly simple. Finn could save everyone inside the construct, but only by staying permanently. No return, no adventures, no future beyond the sealed reality. Rick watched closely. This was the point where heroes broke. Finn stood still. Rick's scanners lit up, stress rising, emotional load spiking, uncertainty flooding the system. The math finally made sense. Choice paralysis. Self-preservation conflict. Then Finn spoke. If I stay, he asked, they're okay? Yes, Rick said. They live. And if I don't, they don't. Finn nodded slowly. No speech, no dramatic build-up. Just acceptance. Rick's prediction confidence climbed. Finn stepped forward. Rick felt a flicker of triumph, quickly followed by irritation. Finn paused at the edge of the construct. He turned back. Can you promise me something? Finn asked. Rick hesitated. What? That you won't do this again, Finn said. Not to anyone. Rick frowned. You're negotiating? Finn smiled faintly. I guess. Rick stared at him. Finn wasn't just choosing sacrifice. He was setting a boundary. Rick terminated the construct instantly. The world snapped back into ooze colors. Finn staggered, catching his balance. Whoa. Okay. That was intense. Rick stood motionless. The test had failed. Again. Finn hadn't chosen sacrifice out of desperation. He'd chosen it because he trusted someone else to take responsibility after. Rick exhaled sharply. You didn't even ask what happens to you, Rick said. Finn shrugged. Didn't seem like the important part. Rick looked away. This wasn't ignorance. This was intentional deprioritization of self. Science couldn't control something that refused to center itself. Rick realized then that he wasn't facing a hero. He was facing a philosophy. Rick shut down every active device. The hum of machinery faded, leaving only the natural sounds of ooh, distant wind, soft movement, life continuing as if nothing monumental had just occurred. Finn sat on a nearby rock, catching his breath. He didn't look shaken. If anything, he looked thoughtful, like someone considering a question he hadn't expected to be asked. Rick paced. For the first time since he'd begun studying Finn, Rick wasn't collecting data, he wasn't running predictions or calculating outcomes. He was thinking. "You know," Rick said, breaking the silence, "what you do isn't scalable." Finn glanced up. "What do you mean?" "Your way," Rick continued. "It works for you. But universes can't run on people who ignore self-preservation. Systems need incentives, fear, control." Finn considered that. "Maybe," he said. "But people need someone to show up." Rick stopped. That sentence landed harder than any argument. Rick had seen countless civilizations collapse because individuals refused to compromise for the greater system. He'd watched logic erase empathy, and empathy destabilize logic. Finn stood somewhere in between. "You're inefficient," Rick said. "You waste potential. You risk everything." Finn nodded. "Yeah, sometimes." Rick expected defensiveness. Instead, Finn smiled softly. "But I sleep okay." Rick turned away, jaw tight. That was it. Not victory, not a legacy, not order. Peace. Rick looked back at Finn, truly looked this time, not as an anomaly, not as a variable, but as a person who had chosen a rule Rick had long abandoned. Be present, help when you can, accept the cost. Rick felt a familiar urge, the instinct to dismiss, to mock, to retreat into intellect. He resisted it. "You're not wrong," Rick said quietly. "You're just inconvenient." Finn laughed. "I get that a lot." Rick opened a portal, its green glow softer than before. "I can't control what you are," Rick admitted, "and that bothers me." Finn stood. "You don't have to control it." Rick hesitated at the threshold. "That's the problem," he said. He stepped through the portal and vanished. Finn watched the space where Rick had been, then shrugged and picked up his sword. Somewhere across the multiverse, Rick Sanchez carried something new with him. There was no explosion of color, no collapsing reality. Just a sudden stillness, as if sound itself had decided to step back. Finn felt it immediately. "This place feels quiet," he said. Rick didn't answer. The space around them resembled a fractured garage floating in darkness. Familiar shapes drifted in and out of focus, workbenches, broken devices, unfinished equations glowing faintly in the air. This was where Rick thought, or where he avoided thinking. "I'm isolating variables," Rick said flatly. "You included." Finn nodded, uncertain. Rick activated his internal AI. Data streams flickered to life, weaving through memory and logic. Finn felt pressure behind his eyes, not pain, but scrutiny. "Your unpredictability is noise," Rick continued. "Noise can be filtered." The AI began reconstructing Finn's choices, stripping away context, emotion, relationships. Each action reduced to decision trees and probability weights. The system trembled. Warnings appeared instantly. "Inconsistent input. Variable refuses normalization." Rick ignored them. That's when Jake appeared. Not physically, but conceptually. A ripple passed through the space, and Jake's elastic laughter echoed from nowhere. The environment warped, stretching and snapping back into place. "What the heck is this?" Jake's voice said, amused and curious. Rick stiffened. He's not supposed to be here. Jake's presence multiplied Finn's signal. Emotional resonance surged. Chaos bloomed. Rick's equations began to blur. "Whoa," Finn said. "Jake's kinda everywhere." Jake's outline stretched across the void, wrapping around floating equations, bending them like rubber. Logic lost tension. Structure sagged. Rick's AI recalibrated. then recalibrated again, then stalled. Error, cascade failure. Rick slammed a control into existence, forcing the system to focus. Out, Rick snapped. You're interfering. Jake laughed. Buddy, interference is kind of my thing. The space shook. Finn watched Rick closely now, not as a subject, but as someone under pressure. Rick's confidence wavered. His control slipped. This wasn't analysis anymore. This was defense. And Finn began to sense something beneath Rick's irritation. Not anger, fear. The space destabilized. Equations fractured mid-symbol. Data streams twisted into looping spirals, feeding back into themselves. Rick's internal AI struggled to maintain coherence as Finn and Jake's presence warped the system beyond acceptable parameters. Rick's voice sharpened. You're not variables. You're contamination. Jake's laughter echoed again, softer this time. Man, that's harsh. But beneath the humor, something else surfaced. Rick's mind responded the only way it knew how, by retreating. Walls of memory rose around them. Not simulations. Regrets. Images forced themselves into the space. Worlds Rick had abandoned after fixing them. Civilizations stabilized, just enough to survive and then left to decay. Names Rick no longer remembered. Finn's chest tightened. Then came Morty. Not the Morty who joked and complained, but versions Rick had left behind. Mortys who had learned too much. Mortys who had trusted him. Rick tried to suppress the images. The AI attempted to purge them. It failed. Error, emotional overflow. Finn stepped closer to one of the floating memories. A young Morty stood there, shaking, looking toward Rick for guidance that never came. Finn turned to Rick. You didn't mean to hurt them. Rick didn't answer. Jake's form shifted, stretching protectively around Finn. Dude, he said gently, you're carrying a lot. Rick snapped. I carry responsibility. No, Finn said quietly. You carry control. That hit. Rick's systems faltered again. The environment dimmed, colors draining into grayscale. Finn realized then what Rick had been trying to do all along. He wasn't isolating Finn. He was isolating himself from uncertainty. Rick's genius had always depended on one belief that everything could be reduced, predicted, and contained. Anything that couldn't be became a threat. Finn wasn't dangerous because he was strong. He was dangerous because he made control optional. Rick backed away, the space folding inward as he tried to regain dominance. You don't understand, he said. If I can't control it, I can't protect anyone. Finn shook his head. You can't protect people by treating them like outcomes. Silence fell. Rick's AI went dark. For the first time, Rick Sanchez stood without his equations. And without them, he was just a man surrounded by the consequences of his choices. The fractured garage dissolved, replaced by something raw and unfinished, an open void filled with drifting fragments of Rick's thoughts. Equations no longer held the space together. Emotion did. Rick stood still, shoulders tense, eyes darting as if searching for something to anchor himself to. This isn't how it's supposed to work, he muttered. Finn took a careful step forward. Without the hum of machines, Rick felt exposed, smaller, human. Jake's presence stretched again, unintentionally amplifying the instability. Memories overlapped, laughter turning into screams, success into abandonment, control into isolation. Rick pressed his hands to his temples. Stop, he said. Not as a command, as a request. Finn noticed. That was new. Rick's mind replayed a familiar pattern. Discover a problem. Fix it just enough. Move on. Never stay long enough to see the consequences. Never give uncertainty time to grow teeth. Because uncertainty couldn't be managed. Finn watched a memory unfold, Rick standing over a ruined world, calculating survival percentages, while people waited for answers he didn't give. "Why don't you stay?" Finn asked gently. Rick's breath caught. "Because staying means admitting I don't know what happens next." Jake's voice softened. "Man, that's rough." Rick laughed weakly. "I built gods. I broke universes. And you're telling me I'm scared of next?" Finn nodded. "Yeah." The simplicity of the answer cut deeper than accusation. Rick clenched his fist. "You don't see the math. One bad variable can ruin everything." Finn stepped closer, meeting Rick's gaze. "Or it can remind you that everything isn't yours to solve." The void trembled. Rick's mind resisted the idea violently. Control had always been his shield. Without it, he felt the weight of every mistake he'd buried under genius. "I don't trust things I can't predict," Rick said. Finn replied without hesitation. "I don't trust things that need to be." Jake's presence surged again, not chaotic this time, stabilizing. The space steadied, not through equations, but through connection. Rick realized something terrifying. The system wasn't breaking. It was healing without his permission. And that meant he wasn't the strongest force here anymore. Not because Rick commanded it to, but because nothing was forcing it anymore. Fragments of memory drifted past like quiet debris. Equations faded completely, leaving behind something Rick had avoided for most of his life. Stillness. Rick stood in it, breathing shallowly, eyes fixed on nothing. Without his systems, without his predictions, there was no buffer between him and consequence. Finn watched carefully. "You're not scared of me," Finn said at last. Rick flinched. "You're scared of what I represent." Rick's jaw tightened. He didn't deny it. "You don't follow rules," Rick said. "You don't optimize. You don't protect yourself. And somehow, things don't fall apart." Finn nodded. "Because not everything needs control." Rick laughed bitterly. "That's easy to say when the universe hasn't burned around you." Finn's voice stayed calm. "It has." That stopped him. Finn gestured to the drifting memory loss, failure, pain. "I just don't try to own it." Rick stared at the memories of Morty again, worlds he'd saved halfway, lives he'd calculated into survival instead of happiness. He had always believed control was kindness. Now he wasn't sure. Jake stretched out, placing himself between them, not as a shield, but as support. "Man," he said softly, "you can't spreadsheet your way out of feeling stuff." Rick almost smiled. Almost. The void began to collapse, not violently, but gently, folding inward as Rick's mind reassembled itself. "I can't let you exist unchecked," Rick said quietly. Finn didn't argue. "I'm not asking you to." Rick met his eyes. For the first time, there was no dominance there. No intellectual high ground. Just recognition. "You break my equations," Rick admitted. "And that terrifies me." Finn smiled faintly. "Good. It means they weren't finished." Rick opened a portal not to escape, but to exit his own mind. The green light cast long shadows across the void. As Finn stepped toward it, Rick paused. "Some things," Rick said, "shouldn't be solved." Finn nodded. They stepped through together. Back in Oo, the sky looked the same. The grass felt solid. Life continued. But inside Rick Sanchez, something had shifted. Control was no longer the center of the equation. He simply opened a window in reality. Beyond it, Oo trembled. The sky fractured into soft, invisible seams. Colors lost certainty like a painting left in the rain. Probability-thinned outcomes no longer knew where to land. This universe is destabilizing, Rick said calmly. Localized collapse, contained for now. Finn looked out at his world. Candy Kingdom lights flickered. Distant laughter echoed, unaware it might be temporary. What do we do? Finn asked. Rick turned to him. I built a failsafe, Rick said. Anchored to you. Finn felt it then, a pressure in his chest. Not pain, responsibility. If you stay, Rick continued, if you bind yourself to Oo's probability field, it stabilizes, permanently. Finn swallowed. And me? Rick didn't look away. You burn out, slowly, but completely. Jake stiffened. Rick raised a hand. Or, he gestured again. You walk away. Ooh collapses. Not instantly, but entropy wins. The choice hung between them, quiet and unbearable. Rick studied Finn closely. Every sensor, every model, every simulation aligned. Hero archetype. Self-sacrifice bias. Empathy override. Rick was certain. This isn't cruelty, Rick said almost gently. It's math. Finn stayed silent. He looked at the trembling horizon, thought of Jake, Princess Bubblegum, Marceline. Ordinary days that didn't feel heroic at all. Rick waited for the decision. Waited for courage to do what it always did. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Finn finally spoke, but not the way Rick expected. Why is this a test? Finn asked. Rick blinked. Because? No, Finn said softly. Why do you need it to be one? The question landed heavier than any answer. Rick frowned. That's irrelevant. Finn shook his head. If the only choices are die or let everyone else die, that's not a choice. That's pressure. Jake looked between them, surprised. Rick's models flickered. Finn stepped back from the window. You built this expecting me to prove something? Rick said nothing. And if I refuse, Finn continued, voice steady, the equation breaks. Rick felt it. For the first time, the future didn't resolve. Finn took a slow step back, letting his fingers hover over the glowing panel without touching it. The air around him seemed thicker now, charged with an energy that hummed faintly, almost like it was alive. The choice Rick had set before him, the one that supposedly defined him, suddenly felt wrong. Not in a way that scared him, but in a way that demanded thought. Why me? Finn asked softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Why is it always me? Rick tilted his head as if weighing the question carefully. Because you care. Because you've always been the variable that behaves differently than the others. That's what makes you interesting. Predictable only in your unpredictability. Finn frowned, feeling the pull of expectation, the invisible hand guiding him toward the heroic path, toward self-sacrifice. But something deep inside rebelled. He realized that the test wasn't just about saving Ooh. It wasn't about courage or strength. It was about compliance, about proving he fit into the patterns Rick had calculated, proving that, even when faced with ultimate choice, he would follow the script. And Finn didn't want to be a script. He took another step back, letting the glow of the panel wash over his face, illuminating the uncertainty in his eyes. Maybe the test is the trap, he murmured. Maybe the whole point isn't to see what I do, but to see if I do what I'm expected to do. Rick's brow lifted, and for the first time, there was no hint of certainty in his expression. The scientist's hands fell to his sides, the air between them thick with silence. Finn felt a strange calm settle over him. Not the adrenaline rush of a heroic decision, but a quiet clarity like stepping into a place he had always known but never acknowledged. And I won't play by your rules, Finn continued, his voice stronger now, steady though still soft. Not this time. If there's a choice, I'll make it my own. Not the one you calculated. Not the one you predicted. Rick didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, almost unbearably, but Finn held his ground. He realized that the test, as terrifying as it was, had no power over him, unless he gave it power. The fear, the expectations, the probability collapses. All of it only mattered if he allowed it to. And he wouldn't. Finn stepped closer to the panel again, but this time with purpose, not hesitation. He studied the glowing paths, the one pulsing with the fate of ooh and the other fading into shadows. And he saw them differently now, not as choices forced upon him, but as reflections of a mind trying to predict what was impossible to predict. He took a deep breath. "You think this proves something about me?" Finn said softly, eyes meeting Rick's. But it doesn't. It proves something about you." Rick's jaw tightened, and for the first time there was a flicker of unease in his gaze. "Careful, kid. You're treading dangerous territory. These simulations, they don't just predict. They react. Every choice, every hesitation, every thought, even questioning the test itself, changes the outcome." Finn's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the thrill of clarity. "Then I'll question it," he said. "I'll question everything about it. I'm not here to follow probabilities or timelines. I'm here to decide on my own terms." He reached out, not to press a button, but to hover his hand between the two paths, letting the energy pulse around him. The hum of the machine intensified, almost as if it sensed defiance, almost as if it were trying to sway him, to bend him toward the expected choice. But Finn held firm. Quietly, deliberately, he imagined a different path, not one laid out by Rick, not one calculated by science, but one that belonged entirely to him. Rick's usual confident smirk faltered, replaced by a thin line of tension. "You're really doing it. You're really thinking outside the algorithm. That's unexpected." Finn didn't respond immediately. He closed his eyes, letting the energy wash over him, feeling it pulse not as a trap, but as raw potential. In that moment, he understood something he hadn't before. The test itself had been irrelevant. The real choice wasn't between heroism and self-preservation. The real choice was whether he would let anyone, any formula, any expectation, even Rick himself, define who he was. Finn opened his eyes slowly, letting the glow of the panel reflect the calm determination in his gaze. The room was silent except for the faint hum of machinery, a rhythm that seemed to slow as if the very air was listening. He didn't step toward the path that promised heroism, nor did he retreat into shadows. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, choosing neither, choosing himself, and the freedom to define his own actions. Rick's expression shifted from confidence to disbelief. His arms, once crossed so firmly, now hung loosely at his sides. You're doing something no simulation accounted for. You're rejecting the variables entirely." His voice was quieter than usual, almost reverent, almost afraid. Finn took a deep, steadying breath. "I'm not rejecting anything, Rick. I'm understanding it. I'm seeing the test for what it really is, not a measure of courage, not a measure of duty, just a question. And I get to answer it my way." The panel flickered, its lights wavering as if struggling to adjust to his defiance. The air crackled softly, but Finn didn't flinch. He felt a sense of liberation he had never experienced before, a quiet certainty that his value, his choices, were not dictated by probability or expectation. They were his own. Rick stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. though there was no anger in them, only something else, respect perhaps, or awe. "I thought I knew you," he murmured. "I thought I had every outcome calculated, but you're unpredictable, Finn, in ways even I can't grasp." Finn smiled faintly, a soft, almost imperceptible curve of his lips. "Maybe that's the point," he said. "Maybe being human, being alive, means we're not variables to be solved. It means we get to choose, even when the answers seem obvious." For the first time, Rick said nothing, simply watched. The hum of the machinery softened to a gentle murmur, as if the room itself acknowledged Finn's choice. Not the heroic one, not the expected one, but the one that belonged solely to him. A quiet truth settled over the lab. Sometimes the heart defies the formula, and the impossible becomes simple, just by daring to step outside expectation. Finn stood there, calm, resolute, unshaken. And Rick, for once, had no equations, no simulations, no predictions to offer, only the quiet understanding that some choices, the ones that truly matter, can't be calculated at all. The panels that once pulsed with restless energy lay dim, their light softened into a gentle, steady glow. Finn remained standing in the center, shoulders relaxed, breathing slow and even. The choice he had refused, the one that science had calculated for him, still shimmered faintly before him, a ghost of expectation that had no power here. Rick stood across from him, arms folded, watching silently. The usual fire in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a contemplative stillness, as though he were peering into a truth too subtle to measure. He had expected defiance, perhaps rebellion, but not this quiet certainty. Finn hadn't acted rashly or recklessly. He had acted entirely quietly on his own terms, and that, Rick realized, was dangerous in a way that science had never accounted for. "Do you understand now?" Rick asked softly, his voice lower than Finn had ever heard it. There was no anger, no challenge, only the weight of comprehension. "You're, unpredictable. Bravery without calculation. It's a variable I can't control, and that scares me more than failure ever could." Finn looked at him, calm, aware. "I'm not trying to prove anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just me. That's all." Rick shook his head slowly, almost with a sigh. The hum of the lab seemed to respond, fading further into silence. "Some universes," he murmured, eyes drifting toward the fading glow of the panel, "don't need fixing." Finn didn't respond. He simply nodded, feeling a quiet understanding settle over him. A gentle acknowledgement that he had stood his ground, not with force or defiance, but with clarity. He remained unchanged in body, unchanged in presence, but profoundly changed in awareness. The world, or at least remained as it was, untouched by the interventions Rick might have enforced. And in that stillness, Finn felt a kind of peace he had never known before. Rick took a step back, then another, moving toward the edge of the room, toward the corridors of possibility he had once used to bend reality itself. And then he was gone. No fanfare, no warning, just a soft echo of his presence fading into silence. Finn remained, and the quiet of the lab became a kind of sanctuary, a space where choice could exist without expectation, where freedom could exist without consequence. Finn turned slowly, letting his gaze drift over the dimly glowing panels, over the quiet machinery that had once seemed so imposing. Now it felt almost gentle, like the room itself had exhaled. He felt a sense of stillness settle in his chest, a rare, delicate peace that came from knowing he had made a choice that was entirely his own. No calculations, no predictions, no outside influence, just understanding. The hum of energy that had once threatened to overwhelm him now pulsed faintly, rhythmically, like the heartbeat of the universe itself. Finn realized that the test had never been about heroism. It had been about control, about proving that life, bravery, and choice could be contained in a formula. But he had refused to be data. He had refused to fit into a pattern, and in that refusal, he had changed nothing externally, yet everything internally. Rick's presence, or rather, his absence, was a lesson in quiet significance. The scientist who had altered countless realities, who had bent time and probability to his will, had walked away. Not in defeat, not in surrender, but in understanding. He recognized that some things, some universes, were better left untouched. And in that recognition, Finn saw the weight of wisdom that even Rick, with all his knowledge, carried. Finn sank to a nearby bench, letting the soft glow wash over him. He thought of the lives in Ooh, of the friends he had never needed to save through calculation or manipulation, and he felt a subtle shift in perspective. It wasn't about saving them. It wasn't about being a hero in the way anyone else might define. It was about being present, being aware, and being real, fully, entirely, without being dictated by anyone or anything else. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the quiet, the calm, the freedom that came from knowing that choices could exist without expectation. The energy of the lab seemed to settle, like a gentle tide retreating from a shore, leaving behind a smooth, untouched surface. Finn's heart felt light. He felt grounded. He felt awake in a way that mattered more than any outcome Rick could have calculated. The lab was quiet now, almost reverent, as though the walls themselves understood that no action, no intervention was needed. Finn remained seated, his gaze soft, tracing the fading glow of the panels. The room no longer felt like a test chamber or a crucible of expectation. It felt like a sanctuary, a space where he could simply exist without measure, without scrutiny, without anyone's predictions pressing against him. Rick's absence was tangible. Finn could sense the scientist moving through the corridors beyond, leaving Ooh untouched, leaving possibilities unaltered. There was no grand exit, no explosion of intellect or power, just the quiet acknowledgement that some things were beyond even Rick's comprehension, and that sometimes the wisest course was simply to step back. Finn breathed in the calm, letting it seep into him. He thought of every challenge he had faced, every expectation placed on him, every path that had seemed predetermined by others. He realized that courage wasn't always loud. Heroism didn't need fanfare or sacrifice. Sometimes it was simply the act of standing still, of seeing clearly, of refusing to be confined by anyone's calculations, no matter how brilliant they seemed. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The world outside waited. Ooh, with all its chaos, its friends, its dangers. But Finn felt a quiet confidence he had never known. He didn't need to act to prove anything. He didn't need to conform to probabilities or timelines. He only needed to be present, aware, and unafraid of the choices that were truly his own. The panels dimmed further, the last hum of energy fading into silence. Finn stepped away from the console, letting the shadows and soft light mingle around him. He felt the weight of freedom settle comfortably on his shoulders, a gentle reminder that life wasn't always about solving problems or correcting errors. Sometimes life simply existed, beautiful and unbroken, even if no one measured it or claimed it as their own. Finn looked out toward the horizon beyond the lab, a quiet smile touching his lips. Some things were meant to remain as they were, untouched, uncalculated, unforced. And in that understanding, Finn felt a rare, profound peace,